Aloha, I'm Congressman Ed Case, and I'm coming to you with another edition of my Congressman Ed Case reports on Olelo Public Television in Hawaii. I try to give you one report every month on something of concern or of interest in my job as representing you in the United States Congress. Sometimes we come to you from Washington, D.C., as I'm doing today, and sometimes it's back in Hawaii on some of my activities. Today I want to talk to you about a critical part of our world and a critical part of our world for Hawaii, and that is the Pacific Islands, our neighbors, our ohana throughout the Pacific. The Pacific Islands are incredibly important to us. We're, of course, linked to the Pacific Islands culturally. We're completely linked economically, and in many, many ways, Hawaii is regarded as the capital of the Pacific Islands. I have a lot to talk to you about today, and I want to introduce my special guest here, Dr. Satu Limaye. Did I get that right?
Yes, you did.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Limaye is with the East-West Center, which of course is one of our premier institutions internationally, which is headquartered right in Honolulu, in Manoa, next to the University of Hawaii in Manoa. Many people don't know that the East-West Center, besides being in Hawaii, also has an office here in Washington, D.C., and Dr. Limaye is in the office right here. He's an expert on the Pacific Islands. So let's just get to the Pacific Islands right away, and I want to just introduce you right now to the Pacific Islands here on the map. Here we have the Pacific Islands. There are 24 jurisdictions in the Pacific Islands, if you just count the island jurisdictions. Some of those jurisdictions are part of our country, the Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, the Northern Marianas. Some are similarly jurisdictions of other countries or in association with those other countries. For example, some of the New Zealand countries in this part of the Pacific. Some of these countries are in free association with our countries, what we call the compacts of free association. These are the countries of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau. And some are independent countries, for example, Fiji, for example, Samoa. And some, as we've already said, are associated with other countries. For example, we have way down here at the far eastern end of the Pacific, Easter Island, which is actually a part of the country of Chile. We have Pitcairn Island, which is Great Britain. We have French Polynesia, what we call Tahiti, but French Polynesia, which is part of France. And so we have a real mix of countries and other jurisdictions in the Pacific Islands. But what is critical to this region of the world are a couple of things. First of all, they are all the Pacific Islands. And second, the sheer size of our globe that they cover is really amazing when you think about it. Now, when we talk about jurisdictions, we talk about the fact that it is not only the landmass of these islands, which of course is pretty small out there in the Pacific, but we also, under international law, recognize what we call the exclusive economic zone, which is 200 miles around each one of these island landmasses. Now, you can see that some of these countries and other jurisdictions have many, many, of course, islands. And so if you draw a circle of 200 miles around each one of them, they all intersect. And actually, a great deal of the Pacific is involved with the exclusive economic zone. So think about it in terms of a country that's not only the land, but the oceans as well, the critical oceans. Now, if you take the exclusive economic zones of all of the Pacific Island jurisdictions that we're talking about, all 24 of them, and you add that up, the area is larger than the landmass of Russia and China combined, to give you some extent of the size of what we're talking about, the sheer expanse. Now, we know that in Hawaii because we're already familiar with being 2,500 miles away from the mainland. But think about the fact that we're 5,000 miles away from Washington, D.C., and we're almost exactly equidistant between Washington, D.C. and Beijing, way over there. That's 5,000 miles. This is 5,000 miles to Australia. So we're talking about a huge expanse of the world. And this is a critical area, not only for our country, but for our world. And we started out really this century talking a great deal about how the century would be the Asia-Pacific century, and it has certainly turned out to be that. So Dr. Limaye, let's just kind of get into this right away. We've set the stage on the Pacific Islands. I want to start by just asking you to talk about who you are and kind of where you come from and how you got to the East-West Center.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Congressman Case, for having me on your program. It's a delight to be here, and thank you for your service to the country, but also your support to the East-West Center. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center and also the Director of the Washington office that you referred to. I've been with the Center for over a decade. I originally am an immigrant from India, and my first port of entry was Hawaii. So
What part of India?
From the Mumbai area,
Mumbai,
the West
okay.
Coast, as a small child. So I had a connection to Hawaii when I first entered the United States. And
Now,
then
how did your family decide to come to Hawaii?
we came to Hawaii was the first port of entry
Ah.
on the way to Washington State.
Oh, I see.
which
So
is
you
where
were
I grew
going to
up.
Washington State, but your port of entry was Hawaii.
But 30 years later, I returned to work as a civilian for the Navy as Director of Research and Publications at the Asia Pacific Center for Security
Oh,
Studies.
sure.
So I started my
Which
family.
is also, by the way, in Honolulu. It's also one of our other premier
Organizations.
institutions in the entire world, which focuses from more of a defense perspective on the Asia-Pacific region, whereas the East-West Center is a very broad, well, we'll get into the East-West Center, but I just want to make sure people realize that the East-West Center is not the only international premier institution focusing on the Asia-Pacific in Hawaii. We've got many, many, and
That's
the
a great
Asia-Pacific
point.
Center is one of them.
As I always say, Hawaii has the highest concentration of world-class institutions that deal with the Indo-Pacific region. University, people, businesses, civil society organizations, and institutions like APCSS, East-West Center, Pacific Forum, et cetera. So it's really uniquely placed to be kind of the forward presence of the American engagement, not only military, but across society and business and people with the Indo-Pacific region.
And let me just deviate, just because we've used the term Indo-Pacific here a few times, and sometimes, you know, you and I throw around the term Indo-Pacific, but I just want to stop and talk to people about what we mean by the Indo-Pacific. We are really referring to everywhere from the west coast of the mainland United States, really all the way deep into the Indian Ocean to the east coast and beyond of India, and all of the countries and islands and ocean in between. This is also the jurisdiction of our largest Defense Department Combatant Command, which we refer to as Indo-PACOM, the Indo-Pacific Command, which is headquartered in Honolulu. So right in Honolulu, we have the East-West Center, we have the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies. As you point out, we have many, many experts that live in Honolulu and in Hawaii because of the collective expertise. And of course, there is a link, as we will discuss, to our defense in the United States and our allies in the Indo-Pacific, which is Indo-PACOM, which you see right there. That's this Indo-PACOM map. So that's Indo-PACOM's area of jurisdiction, which they like to say is from the west coast of the continental United States to the west coast of India. And
That's right.
Okay, so we were talking a little bit about you, and I got sidetracked there, but
No, just to say that, so my connection with Hawaii is quite deep. Started a family there, first port of entry into the United States, ended up working as a civilian for the Navy there, and now work for the East-West Center. So the point is not my personal connection, but more to the point that if you want to work on the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific region, Hawaii is a key locus point for all of that work, whether on the military side, the soft power side, the engagement with military officers, the academic side, et cetera. So it's a really good point to make about the importance of Hawaii to the whole region, not just the Pacific Islands.
now how many years did you actually live in Hawaii?
7.5.
7.5.
Yes.
So you know Hawaii. You have a good feel for it.
I have a decent feel for it, and was lucky enough that my wife was the tourism beat reporter for the then Honolulu Advertiser.
Oh.
So we got very much into local understandings. But
What's your favorite local food?
I'd have to say that probably, if I'm adventurous, of course, poke from Fort Rugger Market. I know I shouldn't do advertisements, but Loco Moco.
Poke many times.
Yeah,
so
and
it's
Loco
okay.
Moco is good too.
Loco
so,
Moco. Okay, well, Loco Moco.
But you got to work it off after.
Well, that's the problem with it. But it is from my hometown of Hilo.
Oh, I did not
Loco Moco,
realize.
Yeah, I mean everybody else claims it right now, but it's really a Hilo.
Oh, I did not know that.
creation. Okay, well, we're getting sidetracked again. So, what is your doctorate in actually?
International relations, and I focus and have been focusing for the last decades on the Indo-Pacific region. I spent 3.5 years posted in Japan and spent a lot of my time working also on Southeast Asia and on India. So I do a variety of work both for the U.S. government and, of course, via the East-West Center for a number of foundations and other organizations.
Do you have a particular area of specialty in the Indo-Pacific that you would consider that's really your kuleana? As we
I
say?
would say two in particular. One is U.S. relations with Southeast Asia, and the second is working with U.S. allies in the region, which is becoming an increasingly important element of our engagement with the entire region. Whether you mentioned all the islands, I'm always keen to point out that Australia and New Zealand are both Five Eyes intelligence allies, but also key elements of this larger Pacific theater.
And Five Eyes intelligence allies refers to the fact that we openly share intelligence with those countries. We trust them innately with our secrets, and similarly, right?
That's right. The
And
most
let's
trusted
talk a little
allies.
bit about, you mentioned allies in the region, so let's just set that stage before we go into the Pacific itself. We have, of course, treaty allies in the Pacific, Asia-Pacific region. These are people that we are sworn to protect them, and they are sworn to protect us. And we, of course, have our allies of New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Japan, right? I think that's the list.
Yes.
And then, of course, we have...
Republic of Korea.
I'm sorry, Korea.
Australia.
I mentioned Australia. And then, of course, we have very, very countries that, although we don't have a technical alliance with them per se, we have very, very close relationships with them. For example, Singapore would be one of them. And certainly, many of these countries are countries that we interact with on a regular basis, whether it be, Vietnam. India, of course, is key to our future. I think we would both agree on that. And so that's kind of the stage that we're dealing with here. We've got, of course, major interests in Southeast Asia and in Asia proper. We have treaty allies, and then we've got the Pacific Islands. So before we get to the Pacific Islands, so I do want everybody to know a little bit more about the East-West Center itself. So give us a history of the East-West Center and why they are so important to what we do.
Well, Hawaii and the East-West Center are two great things that go well together. And they were established in 1960, the East-West Center, by Congress. And it's partly funded by Congress, but we also get funding from foundations, governments, private donors as well. And the key purpose, as written into the congressional language for the East-West Center, is to promote U.S.-Asia relations through collaborative education, research, and exchange. To me, this is the tip of our soft power and people-to-people engagement. And through it, whether it's artists, journalists, officials, young leaders, we bring U.S. and Asia together. And we do so in our Hawaii programs through education. That is to say, degree programs through the University of Hawaii faculty. So it's very important also to that network of the University of Hawaii. Second, we do it through professional development programs, whether those be for journalists or young officials, et cetera. And thirdly, we do it through elements such as short-term courses, outreach into the region, et cetera. So the brand identity of the East-West Center is really well known in the region. We have almost 60,000 alumni. And in Washington, as a counterpart to that, we focus on the policy issues. So we are advancing our Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific relations through a number of joint initiatives, working closely with the State Department. We do work with the Congress, such as the Congressional Staff Program on Asia. We create a series called Asia Matters for America, which maps out Asia's impact on every U.S. state and congressional district. So we work with all the congressional caucuses. So that combination that the East-West Center brings supplements things that the University of Hawaii is doing, things that the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies is doing by training and teaching military officers from the region. And of course what Indo-PACOM does on the military side of the house and the defense side.
Now, when you talk about one of the things that the East-West Center has been around since 1960.
That's right.
And I think that surprises people sometimes when they think about the fact that the East-West Center is literally as old as Hawaii has been a state. Mm-hmm. That Congress had the vision to create the East-West Center because Congress was very much focused on trying to bridge the gap between East and West. I mean, that's what this is all about, East and West coming together and understanding each other, mm-hmm. Trying to head off conflict, trying to develop cooperative efforts for a whole range of issues, whether it be disaster assistance or education or social safety nets or as you say, collaborative exercises, good governance, which is one thing that the East-West Center is involved in. But I always find that one of the most compelling parts of the East-West Center is, you talked about 60,000 alumni of the East-West Center.
Right.
So these are citizens of other countries, or they could be our country.
Of course,
but other countries mm-hmm. that have come from their countries, mm-hmm. have come to the East-West Center to study, to participate in fellowships, to contribute, and have intermingled at the East-West Center with all of these other people from all over the world. including our country. And then they have gone back to their countries and become leaders of their countries. They have moved up through the ranks. And give us some sense of kind of where these 60,000 alumni are in the world.
Well, it's a little hard to map them all out. They're all over this Indo-Pacific region. There are, of course, some in Europe too, and across the United States. They work in education, they work in governments, they work in media, they work in all the sectors of a full and rich civil society. And in fact, 2020, next year, will be the 60th anniversary of the East-West Center. And there'll be a big shindig of the East-West Center Alumni Conference, which we hold every 2 years. And of course, it'll be for the 60th anniversary in Hawaii, in Honolulu, in early July. So it will bring many hundreds of those alumni back. And people intersect with the East-West Center in different ways. They may have gotten a degree there. They may have attended a journalism training program there. They may have been part of an innovative program that's conducted in the region. They may have been a visiting fellow here at our Washington offices because they're working on a policy relevant issue. So it's very difficult to say how all of them came, but all of them are connected not only with the center, but thereby with each other. So it creates a unique, sort of unparalleled network of U.S. soft power engagement with the region.
Exactly, and I think also it is fascinating that many of these countries in the Indo-Pacific have historical differences with each other. For example, India and Pakistan over there on the far left, India and Pakistan don't get along, and yet there are East-West Center graduates and fellows from both India and Pakistan that are in Indian and Pakistani government right now. They know each other. They communicate with each other, and maybe in a moment of crisis, one of them might say to the other one, "Hey, let's head this off this way." I think that's one of the, the East-West Center has been a safe place in the world for people that come from very different cultures, many of which have, as I said, have been at war with each other seemingly forever. To try to understand each other. So it's not just about the United States interacting with the Indo-Pacific region. It's also about these people interacting with each other towards, hopefully, a better Indo-Pacific.
You're absolutely right, Congressman. I couldn't have said it better. I mean, the fact that we hold journalism programs with Indians and Pakistanis together leads to a lot of understanding that you can't necessarily do in the formal channels. Not to mention, as they go through their societies, they meet in professional organizations, et cetera. So this kind of network, as I said, spans the Indo-Pacific, but by including the U.S., sort of underlines the stake we have in those good relationships and our relationship with the region.
Okay. All right, let's now go back to the Pacific Islands. And one thing that I do want to say is that I was very happy earlier this year to co-found in Congress the Congressional Pacific Islands Caucus. In Congress, we have caucuses, and those are affiliations of members of Congress that have similar interests. So, for example, we would have the U.S.-Australia Friendship Caucus, which I'm a member of. We would have, the U.S. Congressional Diabetes Caucus for people that want to work on diabetes, which I'm a member of. We have never had a caucus that focuses only on the Pacific Islands, and so I was very fortunate to come together with three of my colleagues here, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. I came together with Congressman Don Young, who is the senior Republican, the longest-serving Republican in the history of our country. As a matter of fact, he represents Alaska, and we know in Hawaii we've had a historic relationship between Hawaii and Alaska. Don Young, besides being a friend of Hawaii, is very interested in the Pacific Islands. We also have as co-chairs of our caucus the chair and ranking members, so the senior Democrat, the senior Republican on our Committee on Foreign Affairs subcommittee that is responsible for the Asia-Pacific region. That's Brad Sherman of California and Ted Yoho of Florida, Republican Democrat. So the 4 of us came together and said, hey, the Pacific is so critical, we've got to be a little bit more systematic in how we deal with the Pacific Islands. So we started this caucus, we're getting it up and running. It's been a real great success. The East-West Center has been very, very supportive. Indo-PACOM has been supportive. It's an avenue for us to have these discussions. And so this is part of our effort to outreach to our Congress. And so let's just, again, go back here. We've got 24 jurisdictions, wildly different in some ways. For example, Papua New Guinea has a population of 7 million, And some of these jurisdictions literally have a population of just over 1,000.
That's right.
So you get down to some of the ones that, we've hardly even heard about, like, Wallis Fortuna and Tokelau and Kiribati, which we're familiar with here in Hawaii because it's closer to us. These countries or other jurisdictions, lot of people or hardly any people. GDP as per capita, so wealth really, also pretty divergent. So in Hawaii, for example, we have about $55,000 per person from our gross economic output to many of these countries that have just 2,000.
That's right.
Kiribati, I think, is less than 2,000. So there's some very, very poor countries here, and some countries that are doing pretty well. We know of them as kind of the traditional groupings of Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. We're, of course, part of Polynesia, which runs from Hawaii to Easter Island to New Zealand. That's Polynesia. That's our part of the world. And then we've got, of course, Melanesia in the central part of the Pacific, and then Micronesia, which is Guam, Palau, FSM, and the Marshalls. All interrelated, of course, by culture, by ancestry, going back. But if you take them all, let's just talk about big picture. What are some of the common concerns of the Pacific Islands countries?
Sure. As you say, there are these groupings traditionally. I think there are a few ways in which the Pacific is becoming indivisible, and where some of that is traditional, if you will, groupings are still very relevant, but are being adapted and transformed a little bit. And those relate to the big pictures. One is climate change. Climate change is the fundamental reality and existential issue of the islands, particularly the smaller and low-level islands. Less immediate for Papua New Guinea, but very immediate
because
for
it's higher mountainous.
Mountainous and has much more territory and et cetera. So that's,
whereas a country like the Marshall Islands, for example, I think the highest elevation of the Marshall Islands is, I want to say, 20 feet or something like that.
Something like that. So my point is that's the starting place. That makes the Pacific Islands indivisible because it's such an issue that will affect them all. Second, we live in an era of competition, and particularly between the U.S. and China. So there's competition over power, over the rules and the norms and the institutions that will govern the region. So that's a second really big issue. The third issue is underneath the U.S.-China competition. A lot more countries are stepping up their involvement. Now, to be sure, Australia and New Zealand have been there traditionally, but they've each announced new step-up policies or Pacific reset policies, in the case of New Zealand, to up their game in the Pacific. But so too has India. At the UN meeting in September, India's Prime Minister met with 14 of the leaders of the Pacific.
Why is India interested in the Pacific Islands?
Lots of reasons. They want to be supportive of a free and open Indo-Pacific policy. They have ethnic connections to Fiji, for example. They have some small economic interests. They have some training and diplomatic interests. And India, like all of the countries in the region and elsewhere, operate in the UN system. So you have these sovereign countries which have votes in the UN system. So for lots of individual reasons, niche reasons, as well as broad diplomatic, security, defense reasons, lots of countries are getting involved. This is making the Pacific Islands more indivisible. The fourth issue I'd point out is really important, I think, is the Pacific Islands has traditionally, it has a Micronesian grouping of leaders. It has a Melanesian spearhead group. It has the Pacific Island Forum, which is the most encompassing. But in that spirit, they are trying to issue, over the last few years, more holistic visions of the future of the region as a whole, rather than these traditional groupings. So all of these factors, in my view, are running at kind of currents that are being, if you will, mediated or negotiated. So you have more play by Japan, Republic of Korea. The UK, after Brexit, as you said, has territory in the region, but may play more of a role because of its Commonwealth connections. So there's lots of ways in which the Pacific is becoming indivisible and be far more important in the international context in an era of great power competition.
Now, I guess we could have had this conversation 50 years ago, but we really weren't having this conversation so much 50 years ago. And we maybe could have had this conversation 20 years ago, but when I was in Congress 02 to 07, I heard virtually no discussion of the Pacific Islands. And now there's a little bit more focus here in Congress and in our national environment on the Pacific Islands. And bottom line is, why is that? Why does everybody care about the Pacific Islands all of a sudden?
Well, there's so many reasons to care. I alluded to a lot of our allies, friends, partners are engaged in the region. The region has intrinsic importance because there's a lot of people there that are going to be affected by both natural phenomena and this competitive fluid international environment. There are neighbors. In the compact states, we have some of the highest per capita veterans in our military services of any place. So they're implicated in our national defense. We have a situation where countries like China are beginning to be much more active in ways that could be prejudicial to our interests. Hence, the Secretary of State made the first ever trip to the Federated States of Micronesia, as you'll recall, earlier this year. And the President met with the three leaders. And we've also, as we're coming up in the congressional calendar, as you know far better than I, we're going to have to renegotiate these compacts, so in the early 2020s. So for all these reasons, and for these structural drivers that are moving the Pacific into a greater prominence. Now, it's happened a couple times before in the mid-'80s when we saw more Soviet activity there. But in the last 3 decades, it's been less pronounced, and we're now, I think, at sort of peak Pacific, as I call it, which is that we are really engaged with a lot of friends, partners on fundamental issues of how this region will look and how we will interact with it over the next 2 decades.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, well, I think there are a couple of things that you said that kind of resonated for me. I think the first thing to say is that let's just talk about climate change, because you said that that was the number one issue that almost all of these countries are facing.
Yes.
And what is actually happening to these jurisdictions as a result of climate change? I mean, we've got the obvious increases in sea level, but then what is the impact of that?
Well, first of all, I want to be very clear that I'm not a technical expert on climate change.
Social and economic impacts.
Huge. So already these countries, sovereign countries, have difficulties integrating into the global supply and production chain. They're simply too small. The level of human capacity is limited. Populations are limited. They're far from the main sea lanes.
So just to take that maybe more from a layman's perspective, they're not capable of creating the same kinds of economies.
That's right. They don't have the scale of a large island or even a large independent country. And so there, as you said, a range of development levels. So natural disasters, rising sea levels, salination, all of the attendant impacts of climate change, which are varied depending on where you are, will affect further their ability to be economically sustainable. It will make people potentially, in some cases, leave the island. We have a large diaspora, whether in the US or in Guam or in Hawaii or in California or Arkansas, but also in Australia and New Zealand, of diasporic communities. That could be further exacerbated. Some of these places, according to the literature and the articles and things, say they'll simply disappear. So there's a range of impacts, and politically this is an issue that keeps coming up in the meetings of the leaders, that they need global attention and global commitment to heading this off or delaying it so that other measures can be taken.
So, for example, we could take really any one of these jurisdictions and talk about it from that perspective. But because we're talking from the Hawaii perspective, and by the way, you mentioned the compacts are free. We've talked about the compact countries a couple of times again, and I think we want to stop and just focus on that for a second. After the Second World War, and of course, this was a battleground in the Second World War. Japan had come into most of the Pacific Island countries after the First World War and into the Second World War, and so Japan controlled many of these jurisdictions. And after the war, the United States was given a trust responsibility by the United Nations to care for, really, a number of these jurisdictions, primarily the Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau. Those were called the trust territories of the Pacific Islands. And there came a time when those territories became independent countries, but freely associated with the United States, meaning that although they were independent countries, their association was with the United States. The United States really had a say in terms of their foreign policy, and in return we assisted them with their own development, with their own sustenance. And those agreements are called the compacts, the compacts of free association. One of the agreements that we made with the compact countries was that their residents could move to the United States, live and work in the United States without having to go through the visa process. And we have roughly 40,000 compact residents throughout our country, of which 20,000, give or take, are in Hawaii. Mm-hmm. And we have many issues with them. For example, we're not getting compensated for the cost of their benefits, about $200 million plus in Hawaii every year. But let's not focus on that right now. Let's focus on the fact that if you are in the Marshall Islands, for example, if you're living in the Marshall Islands, your shorelines are eroding away. You have a very difficult time sustaining an economy of any scale. Tourism is small scale. Agriculture is more sustenance as opposed to export agriculture. Hard to do manufacturing. The natural inclination is to leave and to move to the United States under the compacts. And that is being accelerated by climate change. And we're starting to talk about the term climate change refugees in the Pacific Islands. And you could use that analysis for many of these jurisdictions, correct?
That is true. And as you say, this is the way in which climate change at this big macro level has very direct impacts. For example, Hawaii hosting, or the number of Marshallese in Arkansas, working and living in Arkansas. Not to mention, as I said, going to other places, and Guam and Northern Marianas, et cetera. So these are the kinds of impacts. These will have to be dealt with by our government, which, as you know, deals with these freely associated states through the Department of Interior's Office of Insular Affairs. So it's a very complicated process. These negotiations for the level of the trust fund support and the economic assistance will be complicated. One other important thing I would point out about our relationship with the freely associated states is our defense and military relationship. Not only are they in the U.S. PACOM AOR, or what is called the Area of Responsibility. That's an organizational issue. What's really important is, as part of our agreements with the freely associated states, we have a defense veto and a strategic denial element in our relationships with them. So we have major testing facilities, for example, as you know, at Kwajalein. And so this becomes really a threaded process of people, of economies, of natural implications, and military and defense of the United States. So we have to be all in. We have to be all in on all kinds of fronts, and some very hard decisions. I suspect for the Congress and others will have to come forward.
Right. So this climate change and other economic-related exodus is going on for many of these jurisdictions, as you pointed out. We certainly are hosting compact country residents in Hawaii. But if you take a look at, and I think this is correct, if you ask yourself where is the major population of Samoan and Tongan, if I'm not mistaken, this stat is, if not actually correct, close to correct, is not here, but in Auckland, New Zealand.
That's right.
And we similarly have other concerns throughout the region from that perspective. So we've talked about climate change, and one thing I would point out, by the way, is that as a result of the immediate threat of climate change to many of these countries are actually leading the world in terms of what to do about climate change. These countries are the ones that are advocating in the United Nations for more focus on climate change. Yes. These countries are taking steps to address climate change within their own jurisdictions. For example, in Palau, Palau has been an incredible leader in terms of environmentalism, of sustainability of their oceans, of their reefs. They've really been quite advanced, and that's driven by necessity for many of these countries. So we've got to focus on climate change over the long run. But let's come back to kind of a little bit more of the short term. We've talked about defense a few times here. So let's talk about the big one in the room, China. What is China's interest in the Pacific Islands?
China has a range of interests. About 20 years ago, China's interests really started out kind of defensive. That is, make sure Taiwan doesn't get recognition. So they played this kind of recognition war. Then they had a small brief.
Because these countries are sovereign countries.
Many of
and-
these sovereign countries recognize Taiwan.
And they're in the United Nations.
Correct.
So they're a vote in the United Nations, and they are independent, sovereign countries who
That's
can develop their own relationships with other countries.
Exactly so. And Taiwan, of course, interacts with these countries, and many of them. And over time, they've gone back and forth in the recognition. I couldn't name every country and when they swapped, whether they were recognizing PRC or Taiwan, but that went on. I think we need to move beyond that. Just as recently as September, Solomons and Kiribati swapped support from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China, to Beijing. But what's really fundamentally important here about China's role is much bigger than just the recognition battle with Taipei. It's that China now has a normalized presence in the region. That is to say, investment through its state-owned enterprises, loans, a new Chinese diaspora that's emerging, very high numbers and percentages of shopkeepers, for example, in Tonga. The estimates vary between 80%, 90%. The precision is not important as much as there's a new diaspora. That's creating problems. There have been riots in Tonga, Solomons, because of these issues with the Chinese. The Chinese are alleged to have been increasingly having strategic intent, which means Australia, New Zealand, the US have been kind of the first amongst equals in terms of military presence, defense relationships. But what if China has ability to dock its warships or to... Now, there's limits, and there's limits for all of us. There's only 3 countries in the region which have military forces per se. So Papua New Guinea and Tonga and Fiji. So there are limitations, but the general point here is that in this context of great power competition that we talked about earlier, China's role to the Pacific is part of a broader engagement. Now, they also have constraints. If you look at Melanesia, the high proportion of Christians will limit, given the restrictions on Christians in China. The treatment of ethnic minorities.
Are there higher percentages of Christians in Melanesia?
That's
'Cause
right.
this was all a subject of missionaries, and
That's right.
most of the Pacific Islands are Christian.
Many of them are more or less. In Melanesia, you'll find rates from 70% to 80%. So many churches are quite active. The Church of the Latter-day Saints is very active. It's
Correct.
one of a huge alumni network that relates.
And of course, many of the Pacific Island countries are educated in the Mormon, in BYU, Hawaii, for example.
That's
where we
exactly
have,
right.
So there's a real interchange between them from a religious perspective with Hawaii.
Absolutely. Again, another connection, as I said
Right.
earlier, about why Hawaii is such a locus point and a forward presence for all these kinds of engagement.
But let me just go back to my,
Yeah.
my question, my big picture question. Why does China care? Why does China want to get in? Why does China want to get into
Sure.
the Pacific Islands? I mean, it's trying to get into a lot of places,
Sure.
right? I mean, it's trying to get into, Burma and of course Cambodia. It certainly is interested in Korea, and of course Taiwan is its big concern. Japan, Australia. I mean, these are 12 million people here. Only 12 million people across 34 jurisdictions. Big area. Why do they care? What do they care about?
Sure. First of all, as a category of issues, they care about a lot of things that other countries care about. Votes in the UN, making sure that they have friendly relations and diplomatic partners on a range of issues as China's rise occurs.
They want support in the
They
international
want support in the
community.
international community. They want people to vote with them on United Nations. At a minimum, they want countries not to vote against them on their treatment of ethnic minorities or religious practices or other things. So that many countries want friendships with these sovereign countries for those reasons. Then China has its own drivers. The Belt and Road Initiative, which is meant to fund large road infrastructure, building, mining, other projects through state-owned companies in China. They need outlets. Places like Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and others have mineral resources. They want protein. This is a huge, as you said, exclusive economic zone, so opportunities for fishing.
One of the great fisheries of the entire world.
That's right.
Right there in the Central Pacific and Western Pacific.
That's right. So they need food, as simple as that. Now, as I said, there are also strategic intent reasons. Maybe they can create complications for U.S. allies by being present in the region. They can flex their muscles, as it were, by sending naval ships and other military relations. They may seek to have relationships that allow them to, in the future, put up satellites and intelligence and tracking stations. So in this competitive environment, there are sort of, regular activities of diplomacy, defense, et cetera. But in all of these ways, China's presence has now become kind of normalized. Though I tend
Normalized meaning what? We're all
normalized-
getting used to them being there?
People are being used to them. I think just as we are now used to China being the largest trading partner. Last night, a Pew Foundation report came out on attitudes towards China. 50% of Americans think that the economic development of China is generally a good thing. On the other hand, if you look at the same polling that they did yesterday and was released yesterday, all the neighbors of China are very worried about China's rise and have less confidence in it than they do the U.S. So these are mixed pictures, and the same mixed attitudes occur in the Pacific. So on climate change, Pacific Islanders express some frustration with our position on climate change. But they're all completely conscious and savvy to knowing that China is a major emitter of carbons.
The major emitter.
The major
Right.
emitter. So
Double ours.
so they
we're
know this.
But by the way, we're number 2, right? So we're
Right.
not, we don't have, we're not guiltless here.
And I think whatever the rank is, our current posture, policy posture, is less supportive of climate change at the international level. And I think that is more important.
You're being very, very diplomatic.
Yes.
I don't have to be diplomatic. We, our country, has not participated in the international community to the extent of many, many other countries in terms of the solutions to climate change. I'll say it outright. And that, I think you said this diplomatically as well, that hurts our credibility and standing in the region when we ask countries to do whatever is needed to deal with climate change.
Sure.
Okay.
And they've declared that as their number one issue. So these are the ways in which China is getting involved. Now, I just want to say, there is a competition, but it cannot only be about and at China, because our relations, as you said, go back to the trust territories. They go back to the history of World War II. They go back to American narrative of being a Pacific power. They go to our relations with our territories and our states. So just an anti-China posture is neither effective nor completely productive. We have relations because we have relations with these. We just sent out last month an ambassador to Papua New Guinea that will cover Solomons and Vanuatu. We sent out a new ambassador to Fiji. So our relations must be grounded not only in the competition space, but in also the natural bilateral place that we're working with our own interests in the region and those of our allies and friends. And I think that's the larger scope in which we need to put the Pacific.
Okay. Does China have any military installations in the Pacific Islands at present, and do they want any military installations?
That's a question of great debate. There have been allegations in public news reports about wanting to build things in Vanuatu, but they have no bases in the Pacific now.
But they actually just tried to lease an
That's
island,
right, which was rejected.
Which was actually the island leased it.
That's right.
And then the national government
rejected
overturned it.
That's
but
right.
they got the state there.
That's right.
To actually accept it.
That's right. This is what we're talking about in terms of jockeying in competition.
Right.
And I think you can expect to see more of that. Similarly, as we saw the case in the Pacific Islands, there's a case in Cambodia that the Chinese are building a base in Cambodia. This should very much worry our Southeast Asian friends and partners.
Right, and it does.
And it does.
Earlier this year, I was on a congressional delegation with my House Appropriations Committee. 6 of us went to Singapore, and we met with the senior leaders of Singapore and had extensive discussions with Singapore. Has been a great friend of the United States.
That's right.
And their major trading partner is China.
That's right.
Which is similar to Australia, one of our longest serving and best friends and allies in the entire region, who aligns with us strategically. Their major trading partner is China. And as you point out, this is the tug and pull that many of these countries have out here, the reality that they live in. And the Pacific Islands are, how does China exert its influence in these countries? I mean, how does China try to get these countries to, I've heard, for example, a great deal of, these countries, of course, all need major infrastructure. They need harbors, they need runways, they need telecommunication systems. Many of
Ports.
the ports is a major issue. They need fishing facilities, the whole range of issues. And China is, as part of its belt and suspender policy, perfectly willing to lend them the money, correct?
That is correct.
To come in and build those. And how's that going?
Well, it's going differently in different places. There's, in the same way that there are concerns across the whole region, there are concerns, for example, in Tonga about the debt levels that they're facing, whether they can ever pay back these loans. They've had some successes like building in Vanuatu a headquarters for the Melanesian Spearhead Group for the Melanesian countries, but they've also had some difficulties like building the convention center in Vanuatu. So the record is mixed as it is elsewhere in the region. There's concern about the debt levels, there's concern about shoddy infrastructure, there are simple local problems like labor, about Chinese workers.
Right, because many of these projects are not funded out of the local labor force. The
That's
Chinese
right.
workers come and
That's
do
right.
the work and then go home.
That's right. But also management labor relations, even if there are local labor. So you have to get into each project to see, but the general view is, as elsewhere, people are willing to do BRI, but they're going, these belt and suspender or belt and road projects. But like everywhere, there is caution. Malaysia renegotiated several of these projects when the new government took office. And Maldives announced this morning that they are worried about their debt levels to China. Sri Lanka had an issue of debt levels. The same kinds of issues are being faced individually in these countries, depending on the project and the country.
Right. One thing that I think we need to go back to, and which has been impressed on me by many of these countries when I've met with them, is look, the matter of improving our infrastructure for our citizens, it's not a matter of choice, it's a matter of necessity. And we don't want to borrow that money from China under those conditions and this obligation that occurs, because we would much rather be aligned with the United States. But if we have a choice between being aligned with the United States that does not help us and a China that helps us even with conditions with our infrastructure, that's a hard choice for us to face. And I think that leads us to, okay, we've tried to paint the picture of the Pacific Islands, of the modern Pacific Islands, of the challenges that they face, whether it be economic development or climate change. They are clearly part of, as you point out, a larger international competition. We, along with our allies, want the Pacific to be free and open. We don't want them to be, territories of China. And yet we have choices to make ourselves as a country, as a community. So let's start to talk, because we're kind of winding down on time, with, okay, fine, we understand the region perhaps a little bit. We understand their challenges. We understand the choices that they're having to make. Now, what do we do about it?
Well, that is the key policy question that you've raised, and I think there are several things, and some of them which we're already doing. Going back to, for example, starting here and working kind of through the region, the three leaders of the freely associated states had a White House meeting for the first time together.
Let's credit the president for that. The president
Absolutely.
invited the presidents of the Federated States of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and Palau to the White House.
That's
first time,
First
ever.
time. That's right.
Now that's a huge gesture.
It's historic, and it's really important as we come on to renegotiating those compacts of free association in 2023 and 2024. I would also note that, as I said earlier, Secretary of State Pompeo, let's give credit where credit is due, made a trip to the region, and he took the leaders back with him on the plane. These symbolic issues of the deep reservoir for wanting the United States to be not the only presence, but a major presence, is very heartening, and I think should be very confidence building. Throughout the other parts of the region, we're working very closely with our allies. Australia is the top aid donor to Melanesian states. It has the most relationships with PNG and Solomon and Vanuatu. These are Australia's northern defense approaches. So they're critical maritime space, they're critical diasporic relations, they're critical defense and diplomacy and aid relations. So we're working very closely in Australia's step-up policy. New Zealand has long been active, has its own territories and relationships similar, sort of analogous to our compacts here in the region as well. So if we work with Australia, New Zealand, the UK, France, Japan, the Republic of Korea, our own capabilities, of course, and even somewhat far afield, but even countries which will play a more prominent role in the region, India, we leverage and multiply our capabilities.
We're just talking about basic, not basic, but foreign aid and engagement and assistance.
Economic assistance, diplomacy, high-level visits. A little goes a long way. By just showing respect, by the things the East-West Center does. Let me come back to it. I mean, at the East-West Center, we have major programs for leadership and professional development. Not only do they spend some time in Hawaii, but all of these tourism professionals just came through Washington, for example, as part of our East-West Center programs for professional development with Pacific Islanders. We have a North Pacific Women's Program. We have a Pacific Island Development Program historically, and the East-West Center has been a convening power for the Pacific Island Conference of Leaders, which in the past has met with the President or the Secretary of State. So all of these toolkits, whether in the space of the East-West Center, the military officers that come to APCSS that I used to work with, in all of these ways, our relationship as a country, but also in particular Hawaii and its institutions, are critical to engaging this region.
Yeah, so we've talked about, we haven't talked so much about the involvement of our U.S. Military and defense in the Pacific, but one thing that I think we both would recognize and we want to share is that INDOPACOM, our U.S. military through INDOPACOM, is completely engaged and does an incredible amount of outreach to all of these. From Admiral Davidson on down, they visit these countries, even if they're the smallest countries in the region, to have a presence. So we don't want the viewer to think that we're not focused on this from a defense posture, but I think we would both agree that, and you said it earlier, we can't just talk about this from a defense perspective. Now we're talking about what we call soft power, which is the projection of our assistance, of our cultural, of our aid into an area to project our values, to project our hard monetary assistance. But and by the way, you mentioned the countries that are also, we as a country, of course, devote billions of dollars to soft power in this region. Many, including myself, would argue that it's completely insufficient for what we need to be devoting. And a political decision and a policy decision that we have here in Congress is whether we should, in fact, increase those monies. Some don't believe that we should be engaged. I'm not one of them. But these other countries that you mentioned, such as New Zealand, Australia, are devoting far more per capita from a percentage of their overall gross income to aid. And you've mentioned Japan in passing, but I want to say that Japan is completely involved. And that's really incredible, considering that 75 years ago we were in a desperate war with Japan, and Japan, of course, was defeated at great cost to Japan. It was great cost to us and the Allies, but it was also to Japan. So I think it's to Japan's credit that 3 generations later, they are one of the primary contributors of foreign aid to many parts of the Pacific Islands, which shows that enemies can be friends over time.
Very much so.
I think that in the time that we have, which is just a couple of minutes now, I want to turn back a little bit to Hawaii. Why is Hawaii so important in all of this? What is Hawaii's role in the Pacific Century? What is Hawaii's role in our country's choices and future in the Pacific Islands?
Well, as I've said, in a number of ways, Hawaii, we always talk in the military about forward military presence. But Hawaii is in some sense our country's forward presence for engagement too. Not only through the obvious Indo-Pacific Command and the hundreds of activities it does throughout, cooperative on health, medicine, military exercise, training, capacity building, etc. But as you say, Hawaii also has the University of Hawaii, which attracts students from throughout the region. The East-West Center, which attracts people for education, but also these professional development and leadership programs that leads to those 60,000 alumni. the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, which has military officers from throughout this entire region. Through the networks of people who have lived, worked in the region, the religious connections, the social civic society organizations, whether they be professional or missionaries or business entrepreneurs, tourism. So it's hard to think of a state that is per capita more invested in the Indo-Pacific than Hawaii, because of its population is relatively small. But on a per capita basis, the range of ways in which it intersects with this region is, I think, unparalleled. And that's why I always sort of have this line that Hawaii and the Indo-Pacific are two great things that go really well together.
And what's the future for Hawaii and the Indo-Pacific quickly? What do you think we should be doing more of, or more of the same?
Well, more of the same is the baseline. What we should be doing more of is finding ways to leverage those key facets of Hawaii together so that we present a total picture. Too often, Congressman, we are presented in the region as being overly military oriented and not sufficiently oriented on public diplomacy and soft power. Because Indo-Pacific Command is in Hawaii and does such great work and so much work, it sometimes can overshadow all of the other work. And finding ways to balance that out to present a whole picture of American engagement with the Pacific, I think would be really fantastic.
Okay, well, I think that's a really good place for us to stop. Thank you so much, Dr. Limaye, for spending time with us and for your great work with the East-West Center, one of our incredible institutions right here in Honolulu. Couldn't be more proud of the East-West Center. Couldn't be more proud of representing it and trying to make sure that it's funded also.
Thank you for your support.
I hope you enjoyed our tour through the Pacific Islands. Obviously, 1 hour is not enough time to cover all of the incredible issues that we face, but the lessons here are the Pacific Islands are critical to our country's future, and Hawaii has a critical role in the Pacific Islands. Mahalo. Talk to you again.